It was the summer of 1971 when a 26-year-old Ruth Calloway made a decision that would become a quiet legend in the green, rolling hills of our county. It didn't happen in a sale barn, under the frantic gavel of an auctioneer. No, it was a much quieter affair, a more personal kind of transaction, which is probably why it stuck in people's minds for so long. Old Man Hemphill was selling out, his back finally giving way after 50 years of wrestling with sheep and seasons. His farm was on a neighboring ridge to the one Ruth had inherited, and the local shepherds, the big operators, had all come to pick over the bones of his flock. They were serious men with serious debts, driving new Ford trucks that gleamed in the Kentucky sun. They walked with a certain swagger, the kind that comes from knowing the market, knowing the breeds, and believing you know everything there is to know about raising livestock. Let me tell you about those men. They were disciples of the modern age. Their Bible was the University Extension Bulletin, and their God was weight gain. They raised big-boned Suffolk crosses, animals bred to grow fast and heavy on rich alfalfa and corn. Their entire business model was a race against the calendar, a frantic push to get lambs from the grass to the stockyard in record time. They talked in terms of pounds per day, feed conversion ratios, and the latest chemical wormers that promised to keep their fragile, overbred animals alive long enough to turn a profit. They saw sheep not as living creatures, but as wool and meat machines, and they were constantly tinkering with the inputs to maximize the output. They spent that morning walking through Hemphill's flock, their hands expert and dismissive. They grabbed handfuls of wool, checked teeth, measured the width of a loin with a practiced eye. They were professionals, and they selected the best of the bunch, the big, well-formed ewes and the stout-looking rams, paying Hemphill a fair price, but nothing more. By noon, they were done. Their stock trailers were loaded, handshakes were exchanged, and they were ready to leave. What was left behind was a small, motley crew of about 15 sheep huddled against a far fence line. These were the rejects, the runts, the oddballs. They were noticeably smaller than the others, with narrow bodies and legs that seemed almost too delicate. Their wool wasn't the pristine white the market demanded. It was a patchwork of grays, browns, and blacks, coarse to the touch and uneven. A few had strange, almost goat-like faces. They were, by every conventional measure of the time, worthless. They were the genetic dead ends, the animals you send to the locker plant for a few dollars a head just to be rid of them. Mr. Abernathy, the biggest sheep man in 3 counties, a man whose flock numbered in the thousands, gestured toward them with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. "Well, Hemphill," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "looks like you got some stew meat left over." The other men chuckled. It was the easy, cruel laughter of the successful. And that was when Ruth Calloway stepped forward. She had been standing by the old barn, watching the whole affair in silence. She was a slight figure, dressed in her grandfather's worn denim jacket, her face quiet and serious. She didn't look like a farmer, not in the way these men did. She looked like a librarian who had taken a wrong turn. She walked over to old Hemphill, her boots making soft sounds in the dust, and spoke in a voice so low the men had to stop their own conversations to hear. "Mr. Hemphill," she said, "what would you take for those?" A silence fell over the yard. The men turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of confusion and amusement. Mr. Abernathy let out a short, sharp laugh. "Girl, what in the world would you want with that trash? They ain't worth the trouble of hauling." Ruth didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Mr. Hemphill, who seemed just as surprised as anyone. He was a decent man, and he looked almost apologetic. "Ruth," he said gently, "he's right. They're my culls. Always been poor doers. You'd be better off buying one good ewe from Abernathy than all 15 of these." "I'll give you $10 a head," Ruth said, her voice steady. "Cash. $150. It wasn't a fortune, not even then, but it was real money to be spent on animals the experts had just declared worthless. The laughter that followed this time was louder, less restrained. It was the sound of a closed and certain world finding confirmation of its own wisdom. They saw a young, foolish woman, barely out of her teens, squandering what little inheritance her grandfather had left her on a flock of pasture rats. They saw pity. They saw a joke they'd be telling at the feed store for weeks. Ruth ignored them. She counted out the money from a small leather pouch into Mr. Hemphill's calloused hand. He took it, shaking his head slowly, a sad look in his eyes. The deal was done. While the big men fired up their powerful engines and drove away in clouds of dust and self-satisfaction, Ruth Calloway opened a gate and, with a quiet whistle to her old border collie, began the slow walk home, her strange, unwanted flock trotting nervously ahead of her down the country lane. They thought she had bought 15 useless sheep. They were wrong. She had bought a secret. Now, let me explain something about Ruth. She wasn't like the others. She hadn't been raised on modern agriculture. She had been raised on wisdom. Her grandfather, Thomas Calloway, was a man of the old school. He had farmed the same 100 acres of hilly Kentucky land his entire life, and he had done so with his eyes and his heart, not with a ledger book and a bottle of chemicals. He was a watcher. He believed the land held all the answers, if you were just patient and quiet enough to listen. He left that farm to Ruth, his only grandchild, when he passed, and it was the only thing of value she owned in the world. He had taught her things the university extension agents had long forgotten, or perhaps never known. He never aimed for the biggest sheep or the heaviest fleece. He aimed for balance. Ruth, he used to tell her, as they walked the pastures together, her small hand in his large one, any fool can raise a fat sheep on a bag of corn. That's not farming, that's just managing a feedlot. The real trick is to raise a sheep that can make a living on what the land gives for free. His philosophy was built on a single, powerful idea: resilience. He believed that the constant intervention of man, the rich feeds, the chemical baths, the routine antibiotics, was making the animals weaker with every generation. It was creating beautiful, productive, but incredibly fragile creatures that couldn't survive a single season without a mountain of support. They were like hothouse flowers, incapable of facing the real world. He called them hard keepers. "You look for the easy keepers," he'd say, pointing to a ewe grazing contentedly on a patch of tough broom sedge the others ignored. "Look at her eye. It's bright. Look at her coat. It has a shine to it, even in winter. She's never sick, never needs help lambing. She's not the biggest one we have, but she costs me nothing. She earns her keep just by breathing. That's the one you keep. That's the blood you build on." He taught her to read the land as if it were a book. He showed her how the sheep would graze the north-facing slopes in the heat of summer and the south-facing ones in the thin sunlight of winter. He taught her that the health of the animal was written not in its size, but in its behavior. He taught her to be an observer first and a farmer second. When he died, he left her the farm, free and clear. He also left her his journal. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with his neat, spidery handwriting. For 40 years, he had recorded everything: rainfall totals, the dates the first frost arrived and the last one left, notes on which ewes lambed twins without trouble and which ones had to be helped. He had pages dedicated to pasture rotation and detailed observations on which bloodlines seemed to shrug off the internal parasites that plagued every other shepherd in the state. The journal was not a business record. It was a testament. It was a 40-year conversation between a man, a piece of land, and a flock of sheep. It was the most valuable thing Ruth owned. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything, on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever seen a truth so clearly that the laughter of the crowd sounds like nothing more than noise? That's where Ruth was that day. Let me tell you what she saw in Hemphill's cull flock, what all those expert eyes had missed completely. She wasn't looking at their size or the color of their wool. She was looking at them through her grandfather's eyes. She saw that while they were small, their bodies were well proportioned and wiry. They moved with an alertness, a vigor that the bigger, placid sheep lacked. She watched them for a full hour before she made her offer, and in that hour, she saw them ignore the lush clover and instead browse on chicory, plantain, and other deep-rooted weeds that most shepherds considered a nuisance. Her grandfather's journal had entire passages about the medicinal properties of these plants, how sheep that ate them seemed to naturally control their own parasite loads. And she saw the most important sign of all. In a flock where nearly every other animal showed the telltale signs of a heavy worm burden, a dull coat, a soiled rear, these 15 outcasts were clean. Their eyes were bright and clear, not pale and anemic. They were small, yes. They were unconventional, but they were survivors. They were thriving not just on poor pasture, but on neglect. They were the epitome of her grandfather's easy keepers. Mr. Abernathy and the others saw a collection of genetic trash. Ruth saw a treasure chest of genetic resilience. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that these strange little sheep possessed a trait far more valuable than rapid weight gain. They possessed the ability to live. The subsequent decade was a masterclass in patience. Ruth's life settled into the quiet rhythm of the seasons, dictated by the needs of her growing flock and the wisdom in her grandfather's journal. Her farm was an island of self-reliance in an ocean of modern agriculture. While her neighbors were taking out second mortgages to buy bigger tractors and more sophisticated feeding systems, Ruth was out in her fields with a post-hole digger, mending fences by hand. She divided her pastures into smaller and smaller paddocks, rotating her sheep with meticulous care, ensuring the land was never overgrazed. She wanted the soil to be as healthy as her animals. The land, she knew, remembered. The first 2 years were the hardest. The isolation was profound. The whispers from the community were a constant, low hum of disapproval. The men at the local feed co-op would stop talking when she came in to buy salt blocks and minerals. They'd watch her load the bags into her old dented pickup truck, and she could feel their judgment like a physical weight. "There goes the Calloway girl," they'd murmur to each other. "Still trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with those swamp donkeys she calls sheep." They mistook her frugality for poverty, her patience for foolishness. They saw her small flock, her lack of new equipment, and her refusal to go into debt as undeniable proof of her failure. She worked alone from sunup to sundown. She learned the individual personality of every ewe. She kept her own records, an extension of her grandfather's journal, noting every detail. She was ruthless in her selection process. She did not cull for size or for color. She culled for weakness. A ewe that couldn't maintain condition on grass alone was removed. A ewe that needed help giving birth was sold. Any animal that required a chemical dewormer was immediately culled from her breeding program. She was not breeding for the market. She was breeding for strength. She was breeding for the traits that the rest of the world had decided to forget. There was a moment, late in the 3rd winter, where she almost broke. A brutal ice storm had swept through, followed by a week of deep, biting cold. She had been up for 2 nights straight, checking on the flock, making sure the newborns were safe and dry in the small, clean barn her grandfather had built. She lost 1 lamb to a stray dog that had gotten through a section of fence she hadn't had time to repair. She was exhausted. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, and a profound loneliness settled over her. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring out the window at the bleak, frozen landscape. The laughter from Hemphill's farm echoed in her memory. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if they were right. She wondered if she was just a stubborn fool chasing a ghost. Then she got up, pulled her grandfather's journal from its place on the shelf, and opened it to a random page. Her eyes fell on an entry from January of 1948, another brutal winter. "The north wind tests them," her grandfather had written. "It finds every weakness. Do not curse the wind. It is the best shepherd you will ever have. It shows you which ones are true." She closed the book, the leather cool and solid in her hands. The doubt vanished, replaced by a quiet resolve. She put on her coat and went back outside to fix the fence. By the 5th year, the first undeniable signs of success began to appear. Her lambing percentage was consistently over 175%, with most of her ewes successfully raising twins on grass alone. This was unheard of in the county, where the big Suffolk ewes often struggled to raise a single. More importantly, she had not used a single drop of chemical dewormer in 5 years. Her flock was thriving, their immune systems hardened by generations of natural selection. And then there was the wool. What the commercial market saw as a chaotic mix of colors, local hand spinners saw as a palette of beautiful, natural shades. It was also surprisingly soft and had a unique springiness to it. A small community of artisans began seeking her out, willing to pay a premium for her unique fleeces. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough. It was proof. It was a quiet vindication, a secret she shared only with her flock and her grandfather's memory. The turning point, the moment the world outside her farm was forced to take notice, came in the early 1980s. A perfect storm had been brewing for years in the world of industrial sheep farming. The overuse of deworming chemicals had led to the evolution of a new, highly resistant strain of Haemonchus contortus, the dreaded barber pole worm. It swept through the region like a plague. The old chemicals were useless against it. Farmers were drenching their sheep every few weeks, spending thousands of dollars on medicine, and still they were losing animals. The big, fast-growing breeds, with their compromised immune systems, were particularly vulnerable. Flocks were devastated. It was a crisis. Mr. Abernathy was hit the hardest. He lost nearly a third of his lamb crop in a single season. His vet bills were astronomical. He was a proud man, but he was also a desperate one. His entire operation, the empire he had spent a lifetime building, was teetering on the brink of collapse. It was his veterinarian, a thoughtful young man who had heard the whispers about the Calloway flock, who finally suggested the unthinkable. "You know," the vet said cautiously, "there's a woman over on the old Calloway place. They say she's never had a worm problem. Not ever." And so it was that one crisp autumn afternoon, more than a decade after he had laughed her out of Hemphill's yard, Mr. Abernathy's gleaming new truck, a replacement for the one he'd driven all those years ago, pulled slowly up Ruth Calloway's long, unpaved driveway. He got out and stood there for a long time, not looking at the modest farmhouse, but at the flock of sheep grazing peacefully on the hillside. They were magnificent. They were no longer a motley crew of outcasts. A decade of ruthless, intelligent selection had transformed them. They were a uniform, medium-sized breed, with the same alert eyes and wiry frames she had first seen, but now they carried themselves with a collective vitality that was breathtaking. Their fleeces were thick and lustrous, a beautiful tapestry of natural grays, mochas, and creams. They were the picture of perfect, radiant health. Ruth came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. She waited. Abernathy finally turned and walked toward her, his hat in his hands. He looked older, smaller than she remembered. The swagger was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice raspy. "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her tone even and calm. He gestured toward the flock. "My vet tells me you don't buy drench. It was a statement, not a question. I haven't needed it, she said simply. He looked at the sheep again, then back at her, and the question that had been tormenting him finally came out. How? He asked. How is that possible? I do everything the experts tell me. Everything. And I'm losing. You do. This. And you're winning. How? Ruth looked out at her sheep, and a small, quiet smile touched her lips for the first time. My grandfather taught me to look for strength, not size, she said. You and the others, you were all breeding for the one big payday. You bred out the one thing that mattered most, the ability to survive. I just spent the last 10 years breeding it back in. Abernathy was silent for a long time, the truth of her words settling on him like a shroud. He had spent a fortune creating a flock that couldn't live without him. She had spent almost nothing to create a flock that could live without anyone. He finally met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw not arrogance, but a deep and profound respect. I was a fool that day at Hemp Hills, he said, his voice low and heavy with regret. We all were. We laughed at you. We were wrong. He took a deep breath. I'm not here to ask for advice, Miss Calloway. I'm here to make you a business proposition. I need your genetics. I need what's in those sheep, or I'm finished. I will give you $100,000 for 10 of your best ewes and 2 of your rams. $100,000. In 1982. It was a staggering sum of money, an amount that could buy entire farms. It was more money than Ruth had ever dreamed of seeing. But the offer was more than just money. It was vindication. It was the closing of a circle. It was the final, quiet echo of her grandfather's wisdom. In the weeks that followed, 2 other large operators, men who had also been there that day, men who had also laughed, came to her gate. They came humbled and respectful, their hats in their hands, and they each made similar 6-figure offers. The news spread through the county like wildfire. The strange, worthless sheep owned by the foolish Calloway girl had become the most valuable flock in the state. What everyone had dismissed as trash had turned out to be the very thing they all needed to survive. Ruth never sold her farm. She sold them the breeding stock they asked for at a fair price and used the money to secure her grandfather's land for generations to come. She never expanded into a huge operation. That was never the point. She continued her quiet life, her work a testament to a different kind of success, a different kind of wealth. Years turned into decades. Ruth Calloway became an elder, a respected figure whose advice was sought by universities and young shepherds alike. The breed she had nurtured from those 15 outcasts became known as the Calloway Hardy, a registered breed prized for its resilience, its parasite resistance, and its beautiful, unique wool. Her farm became a sanctuary of sustainable agriculture, the soil dark and rich, the pastures a vibrant green. I saw her not long ago. She was an old woman now, her hair the color of her sheep's winter wool. She was walking the high pasture with her granddaughter, a little girl with the same serious, observant eyes. She was pointing out the different plants, just as her grandfather had done with her all those years ago. And as they walked, she paused, reached into her pocket, and handed the little girl a small, worn, leather-bound book. The torch was being passed. The wisdom would endure. The story of Ruth Calloway is a simple one, but it holds a powerful truth. The men in the dusty farmyard that day laughed because they only knew how to measure worth in pounds on a scale and dollars in a bank account. They were blind to the quiet, invisible strength that resided in those strange little sheep. They looked, but they did not see. Ruth saw. She understood that the greatest value isn't always in what is big, or fast, or profitable in the short term. The truest value, the enduring value, lies in resilience. It lies in the ability to stand firm on the land that holds you, to weather the winds that test you, and to thrive not because of constant intervention, but in spite of its absence. The farmers thought they were looking at worthless livestock. Ruth knew she was looking at the future. And time, as it always does, proved her right.